Hello once again, this is Mr. Burnett, and today we're going to finish up our lesson on government's role. In our previous lecture, we talked about domestic policy. Today we're going to talk about the government's role in the area of foreign policy. As you probably can guess, foreign policy consists of a country's policy towards foreign countries. All right, so it's how America interacts with the other 200 or so countries in the world. Now, arguably, the primary goal of foreign policy is national security. If you remember from our domestic policy lecture, we discussed how whatever you think the proper role of government is, just about everyone agrees that one of the primary goals of government is to protect its citizens. That includes domestic issues such as protecting them from crimes at home, but it also includes protecting its citizens from foreign countries as well. And so this is the area where national security involves foreign policy. At any one time over the last decade or two or three, American troops are stationed in somewhere between 75 to 150 different countries at hundreds and hundreds of military bases around the world. America's military has a very big global footprint, and all of this is run by the Department of Defense. We talked, I believe it was in our domestic policy lecture, about the cabinet positions. And one of the original cabinet positions, going all the way back to George Washington, was the Department of Defense. Back then it was called Department of War. We changed that in the 20th century to call it the Department of Defense. The same type of department. It controls the military and defense issues. All right, so we talked last time about how Medicare and Medicaid basically takes up somewhere between 20 to 25% of all government expenditures. The military's around the same number, also in that 20 to 25%. I don't think it's quite 25%, but it's probably in the low 20s. So you see those two big issues, your military for foreign policy, your Medicare, Medicaid for domestic policy. Those two big issues make up not quite, but almost half of all the money America spends, probably closer to 45% than half, but pretty close to half. Now, in addition to the military, we can also talk about the CIA's role. For those of you who don't know, CIA stands for Central Intelligence Agency. It's basically the department that handles spying for America. I put a question mark because since the CIA is about clandestine affairs and spying, we don't necessarily know for a fact what all it does around the world. Certainly there's all sorts of rumors and stories and untold movies about what the CIA does, but I don't want these lectures to move into the realm of conjecture or rumor. So I'm not really going to get into all the things the CIA may or may not have done over time. But it does exist. CIA handles collecting intelligence from the government. It started out under a different name. It started out during the World War II era, where we were basically learning and trying to get intelligence on what the Germans and the Nazis were up to and what their military plans were. Then the CIA became big during the Cold War, trying to get intelligence mainly in the Soviet Union, but other communist countries. Now one of the big roles or the big functions it has is collecting intelligence on terrorism and terrorist groups. So we know what its role is. I don't want to get into how it does or doesn't complete that role because, like I say, A lot of it's secret, and so I'd just be talking about rumors and movies I've seen, and I want to keep this more fact-based. Now, America's position in the world and how it treats its foreign policy has changed quite a bit over the years. In our last lecture about domestic policy, I talked about Washington's farewell address, how he warned against the growth of political parties, and I explained that that advice was ignored pretty much from the get-go, including by members of his own cabinet, who then went out and more or less formed political parties. In that same farewell address, Washington also warned about becoming entangled in the affairs of foreign countries. Now, he was specifically talking about Europe, but he basically said, look, we here in America have enough problems just for trying to build a country. We don't need to get involved in the constant problems in Europe. As background, European countries, France, Russia, Prussia, Germany, to the extent it even really existed as a country, Spain, Britain, they spent pretty much the entire 1700s fighting each other over various land and colonies and that sort of thing. And Washington said, look, leave them to their own problems. We have enough problems here at home taken care of. Now we, by we, I mean, the U.S. and people contemporary to him, ignored his advice about creating political parties. The country took his advice on this not becoming involved in European affairs for quite a while. All right, throughout the end of the 1700s and then throughout the 1800s, America pretty much did stay out of problems in Europe. And in fact, a few decades after Washington, James Monroe was president, and he issued the Monroe Doctrine, in which he added to Washington's farewell address. And Monroe says, okay, look, we've agreed to stay out of European affairs over in Europe, so Europe needs to stay out of North and South America's affairs. So on one hand, James Monroe is following Washington's advice, but he is taking it in a slightly different direction. He is starting to become more forceful and telling Europeans, look, if y'all want to go fight each other in Europe, have at it. We're not going to get involved. But you know what? This business where y'all come over here to North and South America and create colonies, that's coming to an end. All right, so this is really the first big statement America makes to the world that America is going to play a role in foreign military affairs, even if at the time Monroe issued that doctrine, they're really just talking about things here in the Western Hemisphere. But it was a statement that America is going to start asserting its independence and its military might, even though at the time it really didn't have much military might. That would be built up later. So America pretty much stayed that way for about 100 years. Now you're going to have the Spanish-American War at the very end of the 1800s, but again, that was fought here in the Western Hemisphere. America does stay out of purely European wars until World War I. And America, it tried its best. World War I breaks out in Europe in 1914. America doesn't get involved until 1917. So America did its best for a few years to stay out of the war, but eventually, for reasons that are better left for a history class than a government class, Woodrow Wilson does eventually take America into World War I to, quote, make the world safe for democracy. And then you have World War I, World War II, then comes the Cold War, and America moved to the policy of containment, which containment just meant they were going to try to contain communism where it already was and not let it expand. So this is in some ways, this is similar to Woodrow Wilson's Make the World Safe for Democracy. It's a continuation of this American policy that, in the 1800s, America was isolationist. We're going to stay over here. surrounded by two oceans and not mess with anybody, to in the 20th century, America started saying, you know what, we think other countries need to be democracies like we are, and we're willing to use our military to help make that happen. Whether it was fighting the Germans in World War I and then World War II, or whether it was keeping communism from spreading during the Cold War. And it was during this time period that America turned into what is often referred to as the world's policeman. All right, so during the mid to late 20th century, America really started becoming the world's policeman, including getting involved in the war in the Balkans in the late 1990s, when Yugoslavia broke up into Bosnia and Croatia and various other countries over there. We got involved in that because there were some atrocities happening. We got involved in Somalia during the 1990s and various other hot spots and trouble spots in the world where America intervened. And people called us basically the world's policeman. And that's very controversial. Many people don't think America needs to be spending its resources on policing the rest of the world. And we're going to talk about that here in a minute. But first, I want to talk about the Bush Doctrine. That came about after 9/11, after America was attacked. That the Bush Doctrine, and this isn't like a doctrine where George Bush sat down and said, okay, here are these official rules we're going to live by. But they were basically policies that he put in motion, and collectively they're now called the Bush Doctrine. And it basically says that America will attack terrorists wherever they're found, and even regardless of whether the terrorists attacked USA first. All right, so you think about that, that's really a change in the policy. World War II, if you think about that, America didn't get involved until Japan attacked at Pearl Harbor. Even in World War I, as you recall from your history class, America got involved after the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, actually, it was a few years after that, so you can argue if that was a really true cause and effect. But nonetheless, America was at least claiming some idea that, well, we've been attacked, we have to go defend ourselves. But that changed after 9/11. And after 9/11, when America was attacked by Al Qaeda on American soil, the U.S. doctrine basically became, well, we're not going to wait to be terrorists attack us. If we find terrorism somewhere, we're going to go attack it. It doesn't matter what country it's in, and it doesn't matter whether they've attacked us first or not. So you see, that's a much more aggressive policy than America did, at least set forth what they said in the past. However, during Trump's campaign and a lot of his positions is, he says his policy is, quote, America first. And so I think it's a fair question, is the USA moving away from this trend of being the world's policeman into a little bit more of an isolationist position? Now, America is far, far from the isolationists that they were in the mid-19th century. But it will be interesting to see if America takes a step back from being the world's policeman. We've seen it here in the past year or so, where America's troops withdrew from Syria and the Syrian civil war. Now, that's controversial. A lot of people disagree with that movement. Nonetheless, it's a move America took. And so possibly, perhaps in the next 50, 100 years, we may see USA again move towards more of an isolationist position, or perhaps not. That's for the future to tell. But that is a little bit of how America exerted foreign policy over the years. In addition to military, the other big area of foreign policy involves economic policy, especially here in the last 25 to 50 years, probably, as the economy becomes more and more global. Then more and more foreign policy focuses on economic issues. All right. Now, for instance, tariffs We talked about this in terms of domestic policy as well. But tariffs obviously do to some extent involve foreign policy, because if you're going to tax a country's goods coming into your country, you can bet that country's going to tax your goods going into their country. So tariffs are one of those issues. Yeah, it touches on domestic policy because it is a tax, raising revenue at home and protecting businesses at home, but it does involve foreign countries. So it's a little bit of a hybrid. Obviously, trade agreements, NAFTA, which has since been renegotiated and now is officially called the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. It's simply a trade agreement where there may be a few exceptions, but most goods, if they're made in either Canada, America, or Mexico, can be sold anywhere in those three countries without tariffs or import or export taxes being placed on them. Another example of trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, you probably haven't heard of this as much because while the Obama administration negotiated it, the Senate would refuse to ratify it. So let's back up. Let's review our separation of powers. The executive branch negotiates treaties, but the legislative branch, particularly the Senate, has to approve them. And when Obama and his diplomats negotiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership, there weren't a majority of senators who were in favor of that particular trade agreement, so they didn't ratify it, so it never went into effect, at least not here in America. It does exist among other countries, but America didn't join it. All right. In particular, in addition to just simply national security issues and economic issues, there are various other issues that bring the U.S. Into interactions with other countries. A big one that's been, at the forefront here the last 10 or 20 years is climate change. Again, while Obama was president, his administration entered, just one of many, many countries, entered into what are called the Paris Accords. Those were agreements among various countries to try to limit greenhouse gases and to lower greenhouse gas emissions. The Obama administration agreed to participate, but then when Trump became elected, he took America outside or away from the Paris Accords, and we're no longer participating. Now, arms control. Ronald Reagan's very famous for entering into some nuclear arms agreements with the Soviet Union there towards the end of the Cold War. NPT stands for Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's a treaty among many, many countries in the world that basically works to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. Assisting disaster relief is another area of foreign policy. That's what the picture's showing. This was after an earthquake in Japan in 2011. In America's military, we have a base over in Okinawa and in the areas of Japan. The American military helped Japan out, delivering supplies using our battleships, or maybe it's an aircraft carrier, but nonetheless using our military ships over there to help get supplies, rescue people, evacuate people, things like that. Economic aid. This doesn't get talked about quite as often as I think it would, because it's a pretty big issue, but America every year gives millions and millions, may even be probably more closer to billions and billions of dollars to foreign countries. America just simply gives them dollars to help them out with various issues. A big one that did get a fair amount of publicity back when George Bush was president. We signed an agreement where the United States gave Mexico a lot of money to help fight, help the war on drugs, help Mexico roll out some criminal elements down there. But we also give money to other countries if they're suffering from famine or various other issues. And we do this each and every year. This isn't just every now and then it happens. It's a specific foreign policy issue or agenda that America has each and every year to give money to countries that are struggling with one issue or another. Another issue where America's foreign policy kind of flexes its muscle is simply controlling other countries. The most famous example in the last 30, 40 years that I can think of was South Africa. In the 80s, South Africa had what was called an apartheid. That was basically similar to the Jim Crow laws that America used to have, where the races were very, very much segregated in South Africa. And the whole world, including the U.S., basically placed an embargo on South Africa, and they wouldn't trade with them. They wouldn't, it was illegal for American companies to sell things to South Africa, and most countries refused to buy products made in South Africa. And it was an effort to put pressure on the South African government to change the apartheid, to give equal rights to their Black population there. And, we still do this. We do it, in North Korea. We have economic sanctions to try to get North Korea to change several of their policies. Iran, we use economic sanctions to try to get them to give up their nuclear ambitions, and things like that. So a lot of the foreign policy decisions or actions America takes is aimed towards swaying the actions of other countries. Now, when you actually attack another country, that's one thing. But when you just try to control them through pressure, whether it's economic pressure or just sort of a global form of peer pressure, that's more called using soft power. And America, as having a lot of power in the world, can really make a lot of difference through its use of soft power. All right, so now how is America's foreign policy carried out? Well, first and foremost, it's run by the State Department. The picture on the right is our current Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. The position that the leader of the State Department, his or her title is called Secretary of State, and they answer directly to the President. This was one of the original cabinet positions in Washington's cabinet. Remember, he only had 4, Secretary of War, Secretary of Treasury, Attorney General, and Secretary of State. The first one was Thomas Jefferson. And it has always been one of the most powerful cabinet positions. Out of the first 6 presidents, I think, Washington obviously was the first president. He was a general. And then his vice president, John Adams, became president. But after that, the next, I think, 4 presidents after that had all been Secretary of State. So certainly during the early parts of the country, becoming Secretary of State was basically a stepping stone to becoming president. It's not quite that anymore. It's been a while since the Secretary of State has become the president, but it's still one of the most important positions within a president's cabinet, just because they do control so much foreign policy. The State Department operates what are called embassies in pretty much every country. I don't think we have an embassy in North Korea right now. There may be a few other countries like that. But for the most part, America has an embassy in every country. And an embassy, in some ways, is sort of technically part of your country that sits in another country. It's this building where you are kind of considered a sovereign country within that building. And it's where the ambassador works, probably have a residence there. And if you don't know, the ambassador is simply the name for the America's official representative in another country. And so those are some of the key jobs that the president gets to appoint when they get elected. They have to name ambassadors to all the countries in the world. And then that ambassador then moves to that country, at least temporarily, to represent America's interests there. And they live and work at the embassy, along with, depending on the size of the embassy, dozens, if not hundreds, or even thousands of people, depending on the size. There are also places called consulates in foreign countries. These are also part of the State Department. They really focus on helping American businesses and tourists abroad. All right, so for instance, if you're ever traveling abroad and you lose your passport, that's the official document that allows you to leave and come back into the country. You'd probably contact your consulate office for a replacement. And speaking of passports, those are issued by the State Department. You have to have this little book here on the inside. For those of you who don't have one, you open it up, and about the second page, you have your picture, your name, date of birth, all that kind of information. And then whenever you enter a country, the country has to, someone at the border or at the airport stamps it to show that you've been approved, that you've entered the country. And then when you come home back to America, they check out your passport and see where you've been, and that sort of thing. And the State Department is in charge of issuing those. All right. Finally, America carries out its foreign policy by being a member of various international organizations. The most high profile and probably most important is the United Nations. The United Nations was created after World War II. All the countries have representatives, and it's a place where all the countries in the world can discuss their problems and theoretically come up with solutions, before having, a world war. And America is involved in the United Nations. They're also involved in certain important subgroups within the United Nations, such as the Security Council. The Security Council is a group within the United Nations. It has 5 permanent members: the United States, China, France, Russia, and the United Kingdom. And then other countries rotate onto the council periodically. But those 5 permanent members, they basically have a veto power, so that any action that the UN Security Council meeting proposes, any one of those 5 permanent members can basically veto it and cancel it and keep the action from going into effect. So it's an important position that if you're one of those 5 members, because you really have a lot of sway on a certain security decisions that the UN might make. Other groups the U.S. is a part of are what's called the G7, which are basically the 7 kind of largest countries in the world, or at least largest countries in terms of economy. Those countries are, in addition to the U.S., Canada, France, Germany, again, the United Kingdom, Italy, and Japan. There's also a G20, which is just basically 20 of the bigger countries. So there's other various groups that the U.S. is part of, and through those groups, they make agreements, reach deals, set policy for the whole world to some extent. The United States is also part of NATO. That's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. You might have studied this in your history class. Again, this was a Cold War era agreement where basically the Western European countries, the non-communist countries, plus America, entered into an agreement where basically they agreed to protect each other from attack, mainly from the Soviet Union and possibly East Germany was the big concern there. But that organization, even though the Cold War is technically over, that organization does continue to exist. The International Monetary Fund, that's more of an economic group that helps set basically global banking policy or monetary policy. Other similar groups the USA has been a part of is the WHO, the World Health Organization. That's been in the news a lot recently. America just announced it was going to stop funding it because they believe, or at least America is asserting, that the WHO made some errors with respect to this coronavirus pandemic. So America, at least Donald Trump, is threatening to stop paying it. But nonetheless, America is involved in various organizations like that internationally. America also carries out foreign policy through treaties and alliances. A treaty is just a formal agreement that has to be approved by the Senate. And it can be bilateral. Remember, like bicycle has two wheels. Bi just means between two. So bilateral is a treaty between America and simply one country. So there's only two countries in a bilateral treaty. You can also have a multilateral treaty, which is among multiple countries. Think about NAFTA there. Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. the example of a multilateral treaty. But a lot of the things, or a lot of the ways that America makes agreements with countries in the world is through treaties. And this, they settle disputes, make economic policy, and that sort of thing through treaties. You can also have an alliance, which is basically a working agreement with one or more countries. And that will be it on our lecture on foreign policy. So obviously to these two lectures, companion lectures, one on domestic policy, one on foreign policy, I tried to discuss the government's role. Obviously, I had to summarize and condense down. America has a $1 trillion economy and thousands and thousands of government workers. They have a big role, both domestically and abroad. But at least these issues we talked about in these two companion lectures should give you a summary or an overview of the government's role. And now it's your time to decide what you think about that role. Whether you think it's too big in certain areas, not big enough in certain areas, that sort of thing. So now that you understand what the role is and how it's carried out, you get to decide which parts of that you agree with and which parts you disagree